Excellencies, distinguished members of the panel, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to be back here in Delhi for this Delhi Sustainable Development Summit. I've come to India a number of times wearing different hats, but I remember one special occasion when I had the honour as President of Ireland to pay a state visit to this country in the mid-90s. And that was when I realised what a common history Ireland and India shared when we struggled for independence. The letters that Prime Minister Nehru wrote to President de Valera of Ireland and the correspondence between them, the fact that the Irish Constitution of 1937 had quite an impact on the constitution, the later constitution of this country, the fact that our flags look very similar, especially if the wind is blowing. I sometimes don't know whether it's the Indian flag or the Irish flag. And it's a reason why I've been very pleased to have this opportunity to come back in this very special year. And so far, during this conference, I've been very impressed by the positive nature of all of the contributions. Somehow, there's a change of tone which is very welcome. We're all aware of what needs to be done, and we want, insofar as possible, to work well together. So I'm glad to have the opportunity to listen to the views of everyone gathered here about how 2015 can be an unprecedented year. As others have said, if we get it right, this year can go down in history as a year when the international community summoned the moral leadership to transform the lives of billions of people today and in future generations. Because this is the year, as we've heard, when we can agree an effective way forward on two vital agendas: advancing sustainable development and winning the battle against climate change. And that's why I'm very pleased that the topic of this particular session is to look at the linkages between those two agendas. Of course, many people rightly say that they're not two agendas, that there is no separation between them. No reasonable person would disagree with the proposition that sustainable development and climate change are mutually supportive and indeed interdependent. But if that's the case, why are we hearing so many voices from reasonable people who insist that the sustainable development agenda mustn't be mixed up with the climate change agenda? I'd like to spend the next few minutes offering some thoughts on the reasoning behind these voices, because it poses a challenge to us all. If we dismiss these voices, then the task of bringing people together to support both the SDGs and a climate agreement will just become harder. On the other hand, if we work to understand them, we might bring the two agendas together and, as a result, advance the objectives we all care about. To get there, I suggest that there are three basic arguments that we need to understand. The first argument is what I would call the hardened experience argument. Many people, especially from today's developing world, view the Sustainable Development Agenda and its related financing for development process as a continuation of agreements about overseas development assistance or aid, whereby developed countries commit to the provision of aid for the alleviation of poverty and the advance of human development. From a practical standpoint, they see the SDG agenda and financing for development process as a continuation of the Monterey Commitment for developing countries to provide 0.7% of developed world GNI towards overseas development assistance, with a particular focus on the world's poorest countries. They point out that this commitment long predates any commitment to climate finance, and that there's a huge backlog of requirements for this aid in areas such as healthcare, education, and the development of strong and capable governance institutions. As a result, many developing countries are very alert to the possibility that the climate change agenda may result in aid money being siphoned away to pay for climate action. They also point out that the developed world, with a few honourable exceptions, has not come close to meeting its Monterey commitments. So they argue that the financing for development process and the SDG agenda should keep focused on its original priorities and not add any new, often expensive requirements to an already overloaded agenda. So that's the first argument. The second argument is what I would call the focus argument. Proponents of this perspective say that climate action is about a singular issue. It's about greenhouse gas emissions. Therefore, we must focus both on shifting to a world of zero emissions and repairing the damage caused by the greenhouse gases already in the atmosphere. They say that this requires a focused, meaningful, strong climate agreement where everyone carries their fair share of the burden to act, and that we're blurring this very clear objective if we load extra complexity into the climate process by linking it with the SDG process. And the third argument is what I would call the managerial argument. It recognizes that, whether it was right to do this, the climate and SDG processes are different. Those working on one have a hard enough job to do without having to integrate with the other in the next few months. They're also working to different timelines, with the SDGs kicking in from January 2016, and whatever is agreed within the climate agreement not kicking in until 2020. To put it at its most basic, country officials working on one process simply don't have the time to be fully aware of what's going on in the other process. So what are we going to do to really make good linkages? On the one hand, we have the inescapable logic that sustainable development and climate action are so totally interdependent that they have to be progress together. On the other hand, there are real reasons why climate change requires the singular focus of the UNFCCC, why experience shows that developing countries are right to be alert to the possibility that ODA resources might get siphoned off to pay for climate action, and it is a fact that we already have global institutions that treat sustainable development and climate change separately. We have to bridge the divide between the different ways of thinking, and we need to bridge it fast, because the Addis meeting on financing for development is July, and we're already into February. So doing so is a priority for me, both in my role as UN Special Envoy for climate change and in my capacity as president of the Mary Robinson Foundation Climate Justice. In major part, it's a priority because I worry that the context for the Paris meeting on climate change in December will be strongly influenced by progress on the SDGs, both at the Financing for Development meeting in Addis in July and then at the UN meeting to adopt the SDGs in September. If those meetings go badly, then it will significantly impact on our chances of success in Paris. So we must bridge the gap before Addis. And in my view, this means three things, and I will say them very briefly. Firstly, we need those involved in the climate process and those involved in the SDG process to come to terms with the importance of each process to the other. As part of this, we need to work together to craft a clear, honest narrative around the logical synergies between the two agendas, but also around the practical challenges to these synergies, as I outlined a few minutes ago. Secondly, it's hard to overemphasize the importance of being honest about financing. As it relates to financing for development and the SDGs, we need to make it clear that climate action cannot be about raiding budgets expected to support other vital activities in the developing world and the steady progress of the developing world away from aid dependence. We have to make sure that we are talking about additional financing and very serious leveraging of private sector financing. I was pleased to see that this is a priority given to climate finance by the French presidency of this year's COP. Affordable solutions are in reach. They deploy both public and private finance effectively and fairly, and an honest approach to climate finance can be transformative breakthrough on the road to Paris. And we need to bear in mind that it's the poorest countries and communities that suffer disproportionately from climate change disruptions and must be given priority in getting green energy. Thirdly and finally, we need to get finance ministers from all countries to understand both the SDG and the climate change processes. They usually understand the SDG and financing for development process because the financial matters involved naturally come to their attention. But the climate agenda is still too often seen as being the realm of environment ministers. That, of course, will change the closer we get to Addis in July and New York in September and then Paris in December. So the earlier we prepare for the involvement of finance ministers, the better. I believe this is essential to the trust needed for Paris. It's a wonderful year of opportunity. We just cannot miss it. But we need to make really good linkages, and I'm glad we're talking about this at this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.